Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between Jon Edwards and Chris Manning.
So, Krivia and Redzepi have come up on the last two episodes, particularly in relation to his chronomètre contemporain, which we first mentioned back in episode 14, in our Baselworld episode. And at Baselworld, he had unveiled the very first prototype of this watch, which you and I were both very taken by the movement of. And he has, over the past several months, gone through several iterations and is now up to prototype number 6, which is very close to what the final version is going to be. And those deliveries are going to start taking place just a few short weeks from now. But the photos that have come out have just taken the level of execution and finish that was present on that original piece, and that he was very clear was not the final product, but had taken it to another level altogether. And it truly is an impressive piece, and nice to see some more pictures of that popping up. And there's a great article by SJX showing off some photos of prototype number 6 compared to the original prototype that we had first talked about. So what do you think?
As we mentioned before, the original is absolutely fabulous, and the quality of work on the original is unbelievable. The 6th version of it, he's made some subtle changes to it, although not dramatic. But I'm a huge fan of what he's done with this. I have to say, this is maybe the nicest movement I've ever seen from a design point of view.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I've ever seen a better balanced movement just from an aesthetic point of view than this. So I'm a huge fan of this. It would be lovely to see one of these in person, but the photos, fortunately, on SJX is this article is just, they're unbelievable. So you almost don't need to see this thing in person because these photos are spectacular.
Now, one noticeable difference between the two is that the prototype number 6 doesn't have any anti-reflective treatment on the display back. So there's a noticeable difference in the quality of the photos between the two in that respect. But even still, with the way that they've been able to angle the camera and capture a bunch of these photos, it really is an impressive piece. Dufour level finishing, Vautrin level finishing on, as you say, a beautifully balanced and conceived movement.
Absolutely. And this is the sort of thing that I look at and realize that my ideas for my own designs for watch movements need to be reconsidered, because this is bringing movement design to a whole other level.
You've got to up your game.
Absolutely. I have a new target to reach.
Now, one thing I was curious about on the original, and that remains a bit of a curiosity for me, is how the stud for the hairspring on the balance wheel is actually being fixed underneath the balance cock there. There aren't any angles that make it clear to me exactly what he's done there or how he's performed that. It really is just another level of impressiveness. And that center bridge for the center wheel is just next level finishing as well. It really is difficult to get a black polish like that on a rounded and tapered surface. It takes years of honing skill to be able to pull that off to that degree of accuracy and perfection, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's impressive the level of work that he's done on that, and just how fabulous it is.
And the inner angles on all the chamfers, really well done too. He's polished the spokes on every single wheel in the gear train, and a nice little touch too that adds to the symmetry of the movement, as he's been able to nestle the escape wheel down underneath the balance, which is something that Vautrin, can't really say that Vautrin did it, but on his initial Observatoire series that were based on the Peseux 260, it has a similar configuration where the balance wheel, in order to be nice and as big as possible, actually runs over top of the escape wheel. Another nice refinement I noticed on the Akrivia piece is the way that center bridge actually integrates under the main bridge that is holding the barrel down in place. On the very first prototype, there was a more defined difference between the two. Looking down from the top, it looks like the center bridge just sort of melts right into that main bridge for the barrel. But there are, in fact, two pieces. And on the very first prototype, the finish wasn't quite as flush between the two when you take a look at the edge. But on prototype number 6, it's very close to a seamless meeting of those bridges. And the other thing that I would say was almost mysterious to me in the original images that I saw of the first prototype was that the balance wheel just seemed impossibly close to the center wheel and the fourth wheel or second wheel, depending on your school of thought. But essentially, the center wheel there would be going straight up through and driving the minute hand directly, and then you go straight down from that wheel to 6 o'clock. You've got another gear in the gear train that's going to be driving the seconds hand, and the balance wheel seems just to be colliding right into the pinions for each of those wheels. But a couple of the shots here in this article from SJX actually show that Recep cut away the pinion so that the balance can run freely back and forth there. But again, just a really nice, refined touch there, and just really adds to the overall balance of the aesthetic.
In the vein of pieces that we've been looking at and sort of seeing high-res imagery of and sort of disassembling, I've been going back and looking at some of the videos that Peter Speak-Marin has been producing in conjunction with the Watches TV. They've been doing a series of videos called Don't Try This at Home, where Peter disassembles watches and does a running commentary of some of the movements as he's doing that deconstruction. The episode I was most impressed with recently is when he takes apart one of McGonagall's minute repeaters. He doesn't do a full disassembly on it, but he disassembles a lot of the really critical components that have to do with the minute repeater portion. And that's quite an impressive watch, being able to see the internals and listening to him talk about exactly how it's designed and what's going on. And again, a very beautiful movement, the way that it's designed. A couple of very unique aesthetic design decisions. Some of them end up becoming practical design decisions as well. And he actually had, I think it's Stephen McGonagall there chatting a little bit about it and being able to sort of help with some of the disassembly. So if you haven't seen that and you want to see what a truly high-end watch looks like as it's being disassembled, this is a really great chance to see it and get a slightly different view of it. Something that you don't quite get when you're just looking at static photos of one of these movements.
Yeah, it really is a different picture altogether when you're able to see it in action, particularly with something like a minute repeater. And if I recall correctly, I believe the base caliber that the McGonagalls are using was developed by Christophe Claret, who's another independent watchmaker who has done very well for himself over the years. And I believe at least one of the brothers worked for Claret for a time.
Yeah, I think that may be the case. Probably the most important thing about this that I like is I like hearing Peter's commentary as he's disassembling it, because he has some interesting insight into how and why things were designed the way that they were. Some of the other watches that he's done, again, it's the same kind of thing where you get a better sense of why design decisions were made, listening to his commentary, and that's something that you're not going to get necessarily looking at an article written on sort of a standard watch blog or watch website, because the people that are writing those are typically journalists as opposed to watchmakers. So it's nice hearing a skilled watchmaker sort of disassembling these watches and giving his commentary.
Mm-hmm. More on the ground, hands-on, first-hand explanations of exactly what's going on there.
Yeah, and I find that his commentary is approachable. It's not something that I think, even if you're not a watchmaker, even if you're not familiar with a lot of the ins and outs of it and the technical side of it, I think most people would still find it approachable enough that they could get something out of it. You don't need to be a skilled watchmaker already to be able to enjoy it.
And on the subject of mysterious timepieces, you sent me an article recently, too, that was published on Quill and Pad about Cartier's mystery clocks.
Yeah, after our conversation last week about Magic and Ricky Jay in particular, we sort of alluded to the fact that some of the origins of magic and certainly modern day magic came from people like Robert Houdin, who was in fact a clock and watchmaker, and he initiated a few interesting mechanical magic tricks, some automata that were used as magic tricks. And one of the other things that he made was a mystery clock, where he made a whole series of mystery clocks where the mechanism being used to operate the hands of the clock is not obvious. You can't tell exactly what's going on. And I know that Cartier was one of the companies that sort of ran with that after Houdin and ended up producing a whole series of these magic or these mystery clocks as well. And recently, Quill and Pad, actually, I think it was the day after we released our episode, Quill and Pad put up a great article about these some of these mystery clocks from Cartier.
Yeah, Robert Houdin's legacy truly is an impressive one, both in the world of magic and in the world of horology. You can see his fingerprints on things just trickling down over the centuries. And Cartier certainly is one of the foremost clock and watchmakers to have picked this concept up and run with it. And surprising to me is that there often are gimmicky dollar store level versions of things that come to market. And I have yet to see an inexpensive mystery clock come to market that I've been able to find readily, at least. So this is still something that's reserved for the well-to-do in most cases. There is a quartz watch that I've seen from Quinting, but it's still quite an expensive piece that has a mystery dial in it. And just to describe for the listener what we're talking about here when we say a mystery clock, essentially what you have is what looks like a pane of glass, just sort of suspended there in the air, or the pane of glass kind of gives it away a little bit, but the ultimate effect is that you have an hour hand and a minute hand that are moving and keeping time, but do not appear to be fixed to anything else whatsoever. It really is quite an impressive feat of skill and engineering to be able to pull something like this off. And one of Houdin's most incredible pieces is actually one known as the Triple Mystery Clock. And it is a glass dial that is suspended by these tiny little supports. We'll call them arms of gold. And those arms of gold are suspended up on a glass rod, which is then supported in a base that appears to be not affixed by anything more than, I guess you'd call them a series of maybe sphinxes and dragons characters around the base of the clock. And there doesn't appear to be any possible way for these hands to be driven by anything. But sure enough, they are, and they are keeping time. And if I understand correctly, I believe this particular example of triple mystery clock that you and I have been passing back and forth for a bit is actually for sale. But that's at the sort of price where if you have to ask, you probably can't afford it.
Yeah, I wish I could afford it. And of course, as I mentioned earlier to you, I would probably want to take it apart and see exactly what's going on here. It's certainly an impressive piece. There is not a lot of room for, I mean, I understand the principle behind it, what he's doing and how he's made this, but he has not left himself a lot of room for actually accomplishing that task. So the fact he's been able to do that in such a tiny area and be able to drive the hands, because the base of it is clearly where the clock mechanism is. That's where you wind it. That's where the mainspring is located. The fact that he's able to drive those hands through, as you say, this clear rod and up through the base where it doesn't appear as though you should be able to is incredibly impressive. I'd love to see a deconstruction of this. So, Peter, if you're listening and you can get your hands on this, it would be great to see that on the Naked Watchmaker. And this, if I understand correctly, I think this is one of 6 of this particular design. He made a number of them. I know he made a number of mystery clocks throughout his career, but I think this particular design with the clear pillar, I think he made 6 of them. So this is one of those.
Taking things a level up from there, miniaturizing these mystery clocks into wristwatch form is quite a feat. But then to take that a step further even and to make mystery tourbillons is another level altogether. And brands like Cartier and Jaeger-LeCoultre and Tiffany's have all made examples of mystery tourbillons before. And the first of these that I'd ever seen was a pocket watch by Tiffany that they've dubbed the Oracle, that has a T-shaped tourbillon that seems to be suspended in the middle of nothing. And it is actually the tourbillon carriage, and it is what is responsible for the watch keeping time. And then Cartier's take on that as well with the Astro Mystérieux timepiece that they debuted a few years ago, then takes that concept and the whole idea of a mystery piece and fuses them together with a tourbillon that's actually functioning as a hand of the watch, and that, of course, being a mystery piece, is also looks like it's suspended in the middle of nothing. So these are all really challenging pieces of horology to both conceive of and to execute well on. And then at the end of the day, for them to keep good time too is likewise impressive.
And then a similar vein in terms of how it functions, the golden bridge that Vincent Calabrese created uses a similar technique. I think he's using clear sapphire to support his bridge, but he's created a mechanism where it seems to be floating in the middle of this watch case, and he's using a similar idea and technique to what Houdin and Cartier were doing for their mystery clocks. He's just using it in a slightly different way. So, again, same idea, creating this sort of floating watch mechanism, and it's quite impressive seeing what he's done with that design as well.
That's a big part of how he's made his name over the years, is with these watch mechanisms that appear to float between the case of the watch, whether it's a Pegasus or someone's initials or what have you. He has had all sorts of designs, and as you've alluded to, was also the creator of the Golden Bridge, for which Corum is well known. The Golden Bridge itself, to me, doesn't quite fall in the same class, because while it appears to be suspended in the case, there is a distinct point where the crown protrudes from the top or bottom of the case and meets the mechanism itself. But it is still quite a feat as well, producing that piece, because it's the big challenge there is actually getting the gear train to run well in a straight line like that, because the gears don't tend to want to distribute energy consistently for a long period of time in a straight line like that. You generally get better performance architecting that flow of energy in more of an arc, because the gears themselves are turning in an arc-like fashion.
And if you're interested in seeing more about his particular design and more about the Golden Bridge in particular, Elizabeth Dewar, she wrote a book specifically about this called Bridging Art and Mechanics, the unabridged story of Corum's Golden Bridge. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. It looks like an interesting book if this particular design style happens to interest you.
Now, Houdin was known for far more than just his mystery clocks. You mentioned last episode the film The Illusionist, and one of the key parts of that story, in a sense, is based on an automata that he created, wherein a tree would appear to bear leaves and then bear fruit, and he would be able to pick an orange off the tree and actually hand it to someone to eat. And that trick features quite prominently in The Illusionist, and that was derived from an automaton that was created by Houdin.
Houdin created a few different automata that are designed specifically as magic tricks, and that happens to be, I think, probably the most interesting of them and the most impressive of them. having this orange tree flower and then produce oranges that you could eat. And then, of course, the final part of the trick is that the orange at the top is fake, and it opens up to reveal these butterflies that rise up and carry a handkerchief, which usually has a ring that was taken from one of the audience members. And often the oranges would have, something embedded in them, something like a dollar bill that the audience member had signed. And when you cut the orange open, the dollar bill is contained inside of that. So it's quite an impressive trick, and it's interesting to see. And I can imagine in the 1850s when he designed and made this, that it must have seemed like, like magic. Like, it must have seemed completely unbelievable for the audience to be able to see that and not have any clue how this was done, because of course at the time clock mechanisms were still relatively foreign to a lot of people. They didn't have a lot of understanding about how they worked, and they probably wouldn't have seen the inside of a clock mechanism and how that gear train worked and things like that. So the idea of this tree on stage functioning like this must have been quite amazing for people to see. Some of the other pieces that I've seen of his, probably the most interesting one is his magician, which includes a clock. So the base of it is a clock, and I think it's at the hour, I want to say, instead of playing a tune or chiming bells or something like that. There's a magician at the top of it, and he's got two cups that he uses for showing the shell game, where as he lifts the cup, it either reveals or hides various items that are under there. I think there's some dice that are under there, and I think there's a little shell of some kind that's under the cups. There's this whole little magic trick that it does, this little routine that it does of showing and hiding the different items that are under the cups. And that's quite impressive. One of the videos that we'll include a link to in the show notes actually includes a little bit of video showing the mechanism itself inside and some of the cams that are being used to actuate the magician on top of this clock, and showing how it works. It's quite impressive seeing what he's done with it and how he's managed to design this.
Yeah, very meta to be using an automaton to do a magic trick when automata were being used to perform actual tricks by magicians of the day.
Mm-hmm. And there were a number of different things that automaton were doing. They were often trying to recreate real life, and so you see examples of dolls smoking in realistic ways, and obviously birds and things like that. I think those were more of a philosophical attempt to try and sort of recreate living things. These were being done intentionally as ways of fooling people and performing magic tricks for people, which I think is taking it to a whole other level. That's because some of them are very, very convincing. I know if you go through Ricky Jay's 52 Assistants, one of the tricks that he does in that uses an automaton to reassemble a torn card. And I'm not sure if it's an antique one or if it's one that he had made and is just made to look antique or not. Unfortunately, I've never been able to find a lot of details about that particular machine. But it's quite an impressive trick watching him do it. And it will sit there and reassemble this, this card for you. And it's quite an impressive little trick that he does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a neat trick.
Yeah, it's an impressive magic trick even when you just do it by yourself. But having the machine do it for you is taking it to a whole other level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way that the machine pulls it off is what I find impressive about it.
Yeah. Again, another thing I would love to be able to get my hands on and see exactly what it's doing and how it's doing it.
Yeah, I mean, even Vaucanson, who we touched on his lathe a couple episodes back in episode 29, his pooping duck, which was an automaton, in itself was, in a sense, a magic trick, because the the food was not actually being digested. There was a bit of sleight of hand at play there in that what was coming out the other end of the duck was something that was already in the duck and was planted there beforehand. Another of Houdin's inventions that I appreciate is a deck of cards he created known as a protean deck. I've only ever had very brief hands-on time with one, but you're able to almost morph a deck before the eyes of someone several times over. And I have a much simpler version of this deck known as a Svengali deck, wherein you can have what appears to be a very normal deck, and you can rifle through the cards, and every single card looks different. And then with a very simple motion right in front of the eyes of your audience, you're able to have them select a card, place it back in the deck, and poof, all of a sudden the entire deck becomes their card. And Houdin had a variant of this that was a little more advanced than that. But these fall in the category of gimmicks, and I know you're more of a purist when it comes to your sleight of hand magic, but I appreciate the way that these decks work, and it's quite clever in the way that they were conceived. And I don't know if Houdin was also the progenitor of this particular style of deck to be able to perform these feats. But if he wasn't, he was certainly one of the early adopters of this style of deck of cards.
In my case, it's not as if I have disdain for gimmicks. In my case, it's just because I know that I'm not organized enough to keep a set of gimmicks around to be able to pull off a trick at any time. I'm certainly not like a Ricky Jay where I'm going to be prepared in the shower to be able to pull off a magic routine for people. So that's the reason why I've always avoided trying to learn anything with gimmicks, because I know that I would never have the gimmick on me to be able to actually perform it. But some of these gimmick decks of cards and whatnot are quite impressive the way that they're designed. Some of them are incredibly devious the way that they've been designed to work.
Mm-hmm. Part of the skill in being able to make use of a gimmick in any sort of magic work is the sleight of hand required to transition from a gimmick to a fully inspectable prop or deck of cards that you can hand to someone.
Yeah, absolutely. There is definitely skill in being able to use these gimmicks. It's not a foregone conclusion that just because you have a gimmick deck, for instance, that you'll be able to pull off a trick. You still have a lot of work to do to be able to pull it off convincingly. Now, while Houdin certainly was not the earliest magician by any means, he had probably an oversized influence on magicians that came after him. Who are some of the people that you know of who were directly influenced by him?
In terms of directly influenced, there are two in particular who pop to mind. One is Georges Méliès, who's a cinematographer and magician and horologist, upon whose life the film Hugo was based. And the other, of course, is Houdini, who very literally just took Houdin's last name and threw the extra I on the end there. And the two of them, I would say, were very strongly influenced. And of course, countless other magicians through the ages have been inspired by Houdin and his work. But I find Méliès to be an interesting character. He created a lot of the early sort of quintessential silent films that people know of, like a Trip to the Moon or An Impossible Voyage, that were very, very whimsical and out there sort of films or experiences that brought to the big screen what would have seemed to be absolutely impossible back in the day. And I think a large part of that was likely due to his background as a magician. And he had a tumultuous life from what I know. But he certainly had his own impact on things as well, and throughout. And he sort of kickstarted, I would say, the Hollywood that we now know. Because prior to his work, there really wasn't much in the way or of what you could see the seeds of say, a blockbuster film in. And I think he, in a sense, planted those seeds. In terms of modern Hollywood itself, a lot of people often ask me what I think about the movie Hugo. And Um, from a horological perspective, I don't have very many good things to say about it from a horological perspective. It's not really founded in reality,
Right.
from an
Yeah.
actual clock and watchmaking perspective. But in terms of the filmography angle, I appreciate that, and then the magic side of things too. An automaton happens to feature very prominently in that film too. So I guess sort of everything we're talking about was wrapped up in Hugo. Yeah, it was an all right film, but
Mhm.
horologically speaking, not the most accurate.
Right. As you say, the link between magic and movies is extremely important. I know a lot of people, they sort of dismiss the use of visual effects and things like that to fool people and to do things that you couldn't do otherwise with practical effects. But really, movies were just another continuation of magic and illusions and sleight of hand, and it was just another way of convincing people they were seeing something that wasn't actually happening. So really, that all is intertwined, and even though nowadays we're using computers to do that sleight of hand, it really does all come from that original influence of magic and how to convince people things were happening. Because you see examples of apparitions and things like that being projected onto smoke and things like that as a way of convincing people of specters entering a room and whatnot. So a lot of the early use of movies and projection was coming from this world of magic and subterfuge that magicians were trying to they were trying to use the latest technology to try and convince their marks of what was going on.
Yeah, I don't personally know of any films that I can think of that would be considered to have had special effects or visual effects in them prior to Mélier's work. In a sense, he's the grandfather of visual effects in film as well. There's a whole ton that could be said about Houdini and his life and the mark that he left on magic, and of course the multitude of magicians that he inspired through his work and his life.
And he must be the most famous magician at this point. He may not have necessarily had the greatest influence on people because, as we say, someone like Houdin probably had a more significant influence in terms of creating the foundation of a lot of this stuff. But I think it would be difficult to find a magician who was more famous than Houdini at this point.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know which of the Inis came first, Max Malini or Houdini, but they were born just a year apart and both rose to much fame as magicians. And as you said, Houdini is likely the most famous of all magicians, but Max Malini was quite the magician in his own right. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if Houdini happened to have got wind of him, and the name Houdini is a mashup of Houdin and Malini. But there's no question that the real inspiration for the Houdini name came from Robert Houdin. But Max Malini was a magician that Di Vernon, who we mentioned in the last episode, and Ricky Jay both looked up to quite a bit. And he traveled the world and was brought to perform before all manner of kings and czars and presidents and what have you. And he was very well known for his sleight of hand. Something you mentioned last episode, coupled with just a couple of other things through the week, a trick that he was renowned for that fooled Di Vernon, that Ricky Jay was later able to perform for a journalist. My subconscious mind, for whatever reason, managed to fuse some thoughts together, and I think I've cracked that trick that had Di Vernon thrown so badly, and then that had tickled Ricky Jay for a number of years until he was able to perform it for that journalist who reminisces upon the trick in the documentary Deceptive Practice. But essentially, the trick, the way that Max Malini performed it, and another interesting sidebar with Malini, he was actually born Max Katz, and that is the the same name that Ricky Jay's grandfather had. And Ricky Jay's grandfather is the reason that Ricky Jay got into magic, and some interesting overlap there. So you can kind of see why Ricky Jay would have looked up to Molini the way that he did. But back to the trick. It was performed at a dinner table. Later into the evening, he would take a woman's hat and spin a coin on the table and slam the hat down on top of it and ask the lady whether it was heads or tails. And whatever she said, he'd pick up the hat, and sure enough, it would be what she called. And he would spin the coin again and slam the hat down on top of it. And again, have her call heads or tails. And he would lift the hat, and there would be a block of ice under the hat. Everyone just, where the hell did this block of ice just come from? So, Dai had no idea. Ricky Jay had no idea. But between all these different elements, I think what is at play here is that it wasn't ice in the way that we would normally think of ice, but rather it was. I'm not giving away secrets here, because the real secret isn't being able to conjure this up. But I think it's a piece of dry ice, which is essentially solid carbon dioxide. And we call it dry ice because it doesn't melt into a puddle the way that normal ice made from H2O does.
Yeah, as dry ice melts, so to speak, it doesn't leave a puddle. It evaporates into gas, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as long as you're adept at conjuring objects, you could actually keep a piece of dry ice around, and a sizable block of it too, if you wanted to, without it melting or leaving any trace, really, apart from it being quite cold to keep on your person. But dry ice, as a general rule, will sublimate at a rate of about 1% of its volume over the course of an hour. So if you have a big enough block of it, and you're good for quite a period of time.
Although that would be incredibly uncomfortable to try and keep that hidden for any length of time, because that would be rather cold.
Yes, indeed. And I think that's probably a part of the reason why Ricky chose the particular location that he did, as described by the journalist. And I think, too, the reason that this particular trick wasn't done multiple times or recorded is I think you'd be able to pick up on the fact very quickly that it was a block of dry ice. Whereas if you are in the moment experiencing it in the same way that this journalist did, your mind would just be blown in the same way that her mind was blown. And blocks of ice like this are actually relatively easy to come by. I mean, fishermen use them, caterers use them, special effects companies use them, and it's not hard to keep it frozen, just a regular freezer for a period of time. So it would have been fairly easy for Ricky Jay to get his hands on one once he had cracked it. And the size of block of ice that this journalist described, it actually fits in well with a number of blocks that are available on the market. And part of what you had said that kind of tipped me was there are pictures of Max Molini, and he looks very oddly proportioned. And you had mentioned the lengths that some magicians will go to be able to perform their magic. And I get a sense now between what you said and seeing pictures of him and just the proportion of his hands to his body size and the sort of anecdotal history of Max Molini. I think that the elaborate amount of time that was said that he put into getting dressed, according to some records, shortly before his death, and the fact that not even his son ever saw him practice. The only account of anyone ever seeing him actually practice was a gentleman named Charles Miller, who happened to see him practicing through a door that was left slightly ajar in a hotel. All of that, coupled with the seemingly impromptu nature of his tricks, I'm guessing that, or I would not be surprised to learn that he likely wore some form of bodysuit that made him appear to be plumper than he actually was around the middle. And that more than likely he would have appear to have been fat enough to hide things like this block of ice that he was able to conjure up, or in other anecdotes of tricks he performed, he was able to pull a full brick out of a gentleman's hat. That he more than likely was not as he appeared, and probably wore a bodysuit of some sort to be able to hide and pull this sort of stuff off. Now, I don't know where Ricky Jay hid this block of ice on this particular afternoon in a restaurant. But again, it's one of those tricks where you would have had to be there to really experience it and know it. But yeah, I think more than likely he probably used some dry ice.
Certainly at the time of Max Malini doing this trick for people, access to dry ice would have been considerably less common than it is today. I mean, most people today have seen dry ice or they've experienced it. So I think it would actually be a lot more difficult today to pull off that trick and convince people that a block of dry ice was actually regular ice. Whereas when Bellini was pulling this off, it would have been significantly easier to convince people that was just a regular block of ice.
And again, I feel perfectly comfortable divulging this particular thought because to me, it doesn't reveal the trick itself. The big part of the trick is in the conjuring, but I think it is a key element of being able to execute the trick is having a block of ice that's not going to turn to a puddle in your pocket.
But the lengths that people like Malini would go to in terms of, as you said, suggest maybe having a bodysuit available, that doesn't surprise me. There are certainly magicians, stories of magicians who spent their entire lives, claiming to have a limp or claiming to have, whatever, being too larger than they actually were, and as you say, wearing bodysuits or always wearing certain clothes that were loaded with, with various pockets and things like that. And certainly clothes that wouldn't necessarily have been comfortable to wear, or going to the point of having multiple suits that were absolutely identical made. I know there's one interview that I listened to with Penn Jillette from Penn and Teller, and he was saying they have something like 8 or 9 different suits that they use through the series of, through a night. And they're all, to the outside eye, they look absolutely identical. Each one of them is designed and modified in a particular way to allow them to accomplish the tricks that they're making on stage. So certainly most people wouldn't think that somebody would go to the effort of making, let's say, 9 identical suits per person for a show. And that's where magicians are able to sort of get you, because they are willing to do that. They are willing to go off stage and make very quick changes, costume changes, to be able to accomplish these tricks.
And if anyone is curious why I randomly know so much about Malini's life, I haven't spent years researching it or anything like that. Ricky J very kindly did that for me. And following last episode, after having reflected on my introduction to Ricky J through the book Cards as Weapons, I went and picked up another book that he had written that I hadn't read before that is called Of Learned Pigs and Fireproof Women. And in that book, he goes into quite a bit of detail about a number of magicians and various magic or circus-y typed acts over the years that included the life of Max Malini, and pulled together a lot of research that he had done there. So all these tidbits and little anecdotes are pulled from that book for anyone who's curious to dig a little deeper into Malini's life. And another piece of reading material I've got kicking around that I picked up years ago in an obscure little bookshop is a copy of Genie magazine, which is a journal for conjurers. This particular one is from 1964. What drew me to this particular magazine was that it was an issue that was dedicated entirely to the life of Houdini. And inside it, there's all sorts of neat tricks and insights and anecdotes. And the part of it that I appreciated most, working around a whole bunch of jewelers and people who work with their hands, were a collection of Houdini's rings. In Deceptive Practice, the film we spoke about last episode, Ricky J actually commends Houdini and how much he appreciated the fact that he could just walk into a house empty-handed and then just start performing tricks. And the reality is Houdini never really went anywhere empty-handed.
No,
he looked empty-handed, but he had stuff hidden on all sorts of places. So some of these rings are quite neat, and they came in particularly handy for things like his escape tricks and whatnot. But it is impressive what his suppliers, if you will, his Q branch was able to supply him in his rings. And it's neat to be able to see those. So that was volume 29, number 2, the October 1964 edition of Genie magazine, which is still in print and is probably one of the largest bodies, if you add it all up over the years, of work collected and writing collected on the art of, of magic and sleight of hand and conjuring.
Yeah, I know one of the other stories of preparation that Houdini would make that I'd heard about years ago. He would do these tricks where he was completely naked and, being bound up or being put into a cell or whatever, and he would be able to escape. And one of the stories I heard was him having fake scars that he had lockpicks hidden under. So he would actually spend hours preparing for these tricks where he would have these scars, and he had to make sure that the scars were identical all the time. So anybody who saw him multiple times would actually see the same scars over and over again, but they were in fact fake scars. And he had his lockpicks and various ways of escaping, keys and things like that hidden inside of these fake scars.
Well, that I did not know. That's, as you say, it's impressive the lengths that some artists will go to perform their magic. Now, you mentioned last episode that a number of the pieces of magic and sleight of hand in The Illusionist and The Prestige were actually performed and were not a result of any sort of movie magic. Do you happen to know any particular ones that the artists or the actors or actresses worked towards being able to perform?
Well, I know in the case of The Illusionist, they actually do perform a version of Houdin's magic orange tree, and that is something that shows up in the movie. Now, I think that case there is a little bit of magic, sort of movie magic that's used, because they modified the trick slightly, and instead of it just blooming and growing oranges, the entire tree actually grows up out of the base of the mechanism, and I believe that was done using some movie magic, but they did in fact perform Houdin's magic orange tree, and that's quite impressive. So if you see a large chunk of that trick is being done with an actual mechanical tree that they were able to make. I do know that when you look at the magic routines that Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman are performing in that movie, they are actually performing all of those tricks. That's not something that they're not faking that on screen. Just like you see sometimes when you have an actor on screen who's faking playing a piano or something like that, or faking playing the guitar. These guys are actually doing those magic tricks, and again, that was all being guided by and they were being trained by Ricky Jay, sort of off screen to be able to do that stuff. And in fact, in the movie, he plays sort of the mentor for the two of them in the movie as well. So he sort of does double duty of playing the on screen and the off screen mentor for them.
Seem to have come full circle from the clockwork mechanisms created by Houdin in his automata to a modern Hollywood flick like The Illusionist, actually taking one of Robert Houdin's automatons and using it within the film.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. Jon can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.
My printer's been driving me crazy. I think my resin may be bad because I've been having all these failed print jobs that shouldn't be failing. Which I'm not happy about, because I was trying to print some new lugs and they weren't working out very well for me.
You store it in a light tight container?
Oh yeah. The containers they come shipped in are light tight, and these resins are also really susceptible to humidity. They're very hygroscopic.
Yeah, even the FDM printers are quite susceptible to humidity as well.
Yeah. And no, obviously it's not very humid now, but I'm wondering if maybe a little bit too much humidity got into it. So I've got a couple of other resins I'm going to try out and see if I can get them working. I wasn't very happy with that because I wanted to try and get those lugs printed so that I could do some casting this week.
So you're gonna have to get brand new resin, or you're gonna take another shot at it?
Well, I've tried this one particular resin a bunch of times and it's failing on me. So I'm going to try. I've got a couple of other different resins here that I'm going to try. I've got one that's it's a non-castable resin, but it's pretty much the easiest resin I've ever used for printing with. So we'll see if they fail, the print jobs fail with that, then I've got to figure out exactly what's going on. But if I suspect that that's going to work fine. So, and then I do also have another printable resin that I've used that I'm not quite as happy with as the one that I was trying to use. But if it works and this other one isn't, then I'm happy to switch to it, at least for this batch, and then I can buy some. The problem is that the castable resin is outrageously expensive. It's like $200 a liter, so it's not cheap.
That's nothing compared to watch lubricants.
You're right, it is nothing compared to watch lubricants, but you also go through a lot more of it than watch lubricants.
I know, I was being facetious.
Yeah, one of my print jobs probably uses a year's supply of your watch lubricants in terms of volume,
or more. Like, I'm hard pressed to go through 3 mils.
Oh, geez, I go through a lot more than that in a print job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard that Rolex's entire production for a year is just 10 liters of lubricant used.
That's insane.
Yeah, it's quite unreal.
Yeah, that's crazy. I can believe it though when you look at the amounts that you're using. I can understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope that you're able to get these lugs printed up and get some cast this week somehow or another.
Yeah, the other option, I'm doing a retrofit on my tag mill, putting some ball screws on it, and so if I can't get this printer working, then I'm gonna finish the retrofit of the ball screws, and then I'm gonna mill them out of wax instead of printing them.
Okay.
But the milling isn't nearly as fast as the printing is, so yeah, if I can avoid that, that'd be great.